and World War II was all but over. Nations were in ruins and the world wanted peace. Representatives from 50 allied countries gathered for what became known as the San Francisco Conference. Out of it came the United Nations Charter, and the UN was officially created. Fast forward 79 years, and that world order is in shambles. International law has become nothing more than a fanciful idea, ignored or brazenly defied by advanced nations and their leaders, and double standards are more apparent than ever. So where to from here? I'm Annalise Borges, and on this episode of The Stream, we speak to someone on the front lines of the fight for human rights and justice for all.
I always experience a sense of shock and delusion when I come to this room. No one has been spared, not just among the Palestinians and the Lebanese. Even in the United Nations, Gaza is now a wasteland of rubble, garbage, and human remains where survivors hold on to life amid widespread deprivation and disease. It's time to consider suspending the credential of Israel as a member state.
And the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, joins us now from Tunis. Francesca, thank you so much for being part of the stream today in the midst of one of the most contentious times in our history. According to the UN, we currently have the highest number of violent conflicts since World War II. The number of forcibly displaced people around the world reached 120 million in May this year, and by all measure and definition, there's a genocide being live streamed on our phones. I guess my first question to you is, what went wrong? Have we learned nothing from our past mistakes?
First of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Have people learned from the past? Have we learned our past? No, I don't think so. Some of us have and are fighting for the genocide that is ongoing in Gaza to end, because we have memory of the story that has made other genocides possible. Me, as a European, I'm very aware of what leads to a genocide. It's the hatred, it's the ideological, that as often say, becomes political doctrine, is the discrimination against the other that leads not to see him or her as human anymore. However, the most saddening part of it is that today we have a human rights framework, a system of rules, a system of institutions which should have prevented this, and this has failed.
And we're going to talk a bit more about that system and all that order that is failing all of us. But first, we always try to include our community as much as possible in the research and production of each episode. So we reached out to them to ask if they had questions for you. Given the context, we thought fit to start in Gaza.
So my question is, after exposing the Israeli occupation everywhere, why do some states fail to take actions to enforce the international laws when there is clear evidence of a genocide? My second question is, when will the principles of human rights and justice apply to the people of Gaza?
Because it's difficult to receive a question from someone in Gaza, and I will do my best to answer honestly as I do. Why some states are not reacting, are not stopping Israel? Because of a variety of reasons, and the combination is awful and toxic. It's political convenience, it's ignorance, it's racism. I think that there are three ingredients, and brutally put, these are at the roots of the problem. But I would like the people in Gaza to know that they are not alone. There is a humanity that is awakening and seeing what's happening. I know it's late. And I know you have all the rights to be deceived by us, because we are very weak all together, and this is unacceptable. But the responsibility is upon us, ordinary citizens, people from all parts of life, civil society, to hold our governments accountable. You know, I often say justice for Palestine starts at home. So this is the moment, because our governments are violating international law, the moment they do not use their influence to stop the genocide, the moment they do not enforce the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, which has declared the occupation unlawful and therefore to be dismantled unconditionally and totally by September next year. This is what the General Assembly has decided to abide by the ICJ. And therefore, because member states who do not comply are violating with these measures, orders, and provisions, they need to be held accountable because they might be found responsible or complicit with international crimes. But also there are businesses in our countries which are profiting from Israel's crimes and contributing to it, including our fellow citizens living as settlers or working in the settlements or fighting in the Israeli occupation army. So this is why I say justice starts at home, and let's use national courts, strategy and advocacy to make sure that international law is applied. End of the genocide, end occupation and apartheid. And the last question, human rights. Look, human rights, that for human rights is a path, it's a tortuous path, and it's not straight, but every time, at every turn of history, we make from huge human rights violations something better. So it was for slavery, which would have not been abolished without civil society movement, and it was small, and so was for racial segregation and apartheid, and so was for genocide. And yes, the fact that we still have a genocide means that there is more work for us. May this be the last genocide of human history.
I've heard you comment on the backlash you have faced because of the work that you do. Do words like "you inspire us to hope for a better future" from someone in Gaza today, does that make all the rest worthwhile? Is that what keeps you going?
No, look, even if I didn't have one single word of appreciation and recognition, I would keep going. Because this is what I have to do. This is justice. This is something I would never compromise for anything. And you might or might not believe me, but hey, I know what I'm doing. And I always say, no one, no my dearest ones, and they are the light of my life. No one is more important than others. My children are not more important than Gaza children to their mothers. And this is why I keep going. No one needs to endure this. And this is because I've learned from our history, from my own history, that of my own country. Now, you know, there is so much love, so much support, so many people who come to my lectures where we talk about international law, which is, if you want, even boring, and still they cry. There are so many people who come and cry because this is a moment where there is no space for grieving. And I say, let's grieve together, but let's translate this rage, this fear, this feeling of depression, of impotence into action. And together we can do that.
Definitely served as inspiration for many people, including for our next guest here, another recurring guest on the stream and fellow international lawyer, Laura El Borno, who had this to ask you.
After 14 months of genocide in Gaza, we've seen the ways in which the existing international legal mechanisms designed to promote international peace and prevent mass atrocities have been either sabotaged by complicit actors like the US veto power in the United Nations Security Council, or inadequate to compel Israel to comply with its international obligations, like the ICJ provisional measures, which, while they were good on paper, were violated each time by Israel. In light of this, is reform needed to make the system work better? And if so, what is the single most important reform that we should all be advocating for?
I see Lara's point, and I agree. The system, the UN system that we have today, particularly with the veto power, doesn't reflect the new world order we have, because when that system was created, there were 53 member states of the United Nations, while now there are 194. So the system was still held in the hands of colonizers or former settler colonies, or actually settler colonies, mainly Western states and a few others. Now the system is different. So the veto, the first thing that comes to mind is that the veto power should be abolished. And still, this wouldn't be the first thing that comes to my mind. And I do not have a concrete response, but I think that the first most important realization states should make is that they cannot hide behind the existence of the United Nations. The responsibilities to comply with international law are upon member states, and if law is violated, it's member states who should intervene directly, if not through the United States and the United Nations, especially when the United Nations seem not to work. Therefore, to give you a concrete example, why member states are not resorting to suspension of economic, political, diplomatic, financial, strategic, military ties with Israel as part of the law of state responsibility because of the violations and international wrongdoing that Israel commits, instead of waiting for sanctions that might never come from the UN Security Council. So you see, it seems to me that states are also into the habit of kicking the can in the air, and this must end.
And I want to broaden up a little bit beyond Gaza, and obviously you know this perhaps better than anyone. Israel's genocide is just part of the story of Israeli aggression against Palestinians. While the world turned its attention to the Strip, Israel intensified its displacement of Palestinians and land grabbing across the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Here's one question on that particular point.
Francesca, on multiple occasions you have called for an establishment of a UN peacekeeping force in the West Bank in order to mitigate the violence perpetrated by the settlers and by the Israeli occupation forces. And that is something that my colleagues and I have also advocated for, because currently that job is done by activists who are routinely attacked, beaten, arrested, and deported. So my question is as follows: how would we make this happen? How would this happen legally, and what can people on the ground, as well as the wider international activist community, do in order to turn this into reality?
I've been quite vague in the formulation of this, in the sense I've never really advocated for the establishment of a peacekeeping operation, because peacekeeping operations must be authorized by the Security Council. And absent a decision of the Security Council, I've asked myself, what else can be done? Because Audrey pointed to a very important point, an extremely critical function that is served by international activists and Israeli activists who go to the West Bank and East Jerusalem to protect Palestinians, often Palestinian farmers and shepherds, and from the assaults of violent settlers escorted or led by the army. And at the same time, this important function cannot be left on the shoulders of activists, of civilians. And I've advocated for member states to come together, thinking out of the box and imposing, using their leverage to impose the necessity to have the deployment of a force, ideally military force, which could be a regional one in the region or other. But the critical point, the floor on which we should stand, is the ICJ advisory opinion of July this year, which recognizes the occupation as illegal and having to be dismantled henceforth. So I see that Israel keeps on behaving as it had to stay in the occupied Palestinian territory forever. This is not the case. Israel must go. And every other breath we take and we speak on Palestine, we need to assert this. So the member states registered that this is not optional, this is compulsory. In fact, it should have been a precondition to even start the negotiation for a two-state solution. And if Israel is not ready to relinquish its control over the occupied Palestinian territory, it is to recognize full rights to the Palestinians, because it's 57 years of suspension of these rights, and then they will have to decide what kind of states they want to be part of.
Absolutely, because a UN mission in the south of Lebanon did nothing to protect people there as well. And I guess we're talking about
Right.
an issue here that should be addressed from the root cause of the issue and not all these accessories and all these problems that come from that particular issue. If anything, I would say that the past 14 months have served to potentially educate many about over 7 decades of occupation and injustice. And many felt compelled to take action, for example, by joining the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement. And on that, we have a question for you from Berlin. Take a look.
The Palestinian-led movement for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel has faced massive repression for decades in places like the US and Germany, where I live. What do you think the rulings and resolutions we've seen this year from the ICJ, the UN General Assembly, and other bodies mean with regards to the BDS movement's claim that it demands nothing more than the implementation of international law in defense of Palestinian human rights?
I want to say to the BDS movement and all BDS activists, and anyone, in fact, is not even an activist, anyone who has embraced BDS as a philosophy, I want to say thank you. Thank you for leading the way. Thank you for using international law. Thank you for trusting international law, because I want to remember everyone that the BDS started because of an ICJ advisory opinion, the one that 20 years ago recognized that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory through its building of a wall that was cutting the Palestinian territory and separating land and separating people and annexing resources illegally. This was in violation of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, and because no one seemed to pay attention among member states, the BDS movement started, also inspired by the movement, this civil society movement that led to the abolition of dismantlement of the apartheid regime in South Africa. To this activist, I say thank you. Of course, you continue to bring the word of the law into action, into hope for practice, and you are an indispensable part of the struggle for justice and human rights in Palestine and beyond, because the lesson that you have somewhat personified from the past will be an example to follow for many others to bring an end to other injustices elsewhere.
It's been incredible to see how many people got organized and didn't wait basically for their states to do anything. They started doing things and taking action in their own hands. But what remains incredibly disheartening, I would say, is the time it takes for world leaders to come to the same conclusion as the majority of their constituents. We've seen time and time again representatives of the most powerful states sitting around that table in the highest diplomacy body, the one created to keep peace, the UN, and nothing happens.
Those against?
In the past year alone, the U.S. has vetoed 4 Security Council resolutions calling for a Gaza ceasefire, and according to the Jewish Virtual Library, the U.S. used its veto power against UN resolutions on Israel 49 times. There's so much resistance, right? Because there are so many interests that are at stake here. When you're challenging a global order, it takes a lot of us to actually get involved. And in terms of decisions that did make people hopeful, in November, the International Criminal Court issued a decision that was welcomed by many across the world, while others thought it was not enough.
While the ICC has issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, they've also issued arrest warrants for Mohammed Deif for exactly 1 day's worth of an assault on Israel, compared to a year of genocide. To what extent can this be considered an equal application of justice?
Let me turn this question around. We have seen the Palestinians killed, blamed, and smeared for decades. We have seen them being accused of terrorism when they were resisting assaults on their homes, in their houses, in their villages by soldiers who should not even be there. And there is a sort of consensus, there has been an increasing consensus among the West around Israel's self-defense. Now, over 14 months, there is no doubt that Israel is escalating its violence against the Palestinians, and this violence is genocidal. But over 1 year, I've seen the world turning against what Israel, the image that Israel has built for itself, the only democracy in the Middle East, and also the startup nation. This shiny image starts to crumble because the reality is that Israel is an apartheid settler colonial state which is perpetrating genocide. Therefore, in the face of all these, think of how much it has taken to go to get these arrest warrants. Yes, of course, there is no equivalent. I agree with member states who get horrified to see the equivalence between the Israeli leaders and the Palestinian armed groups. Because again, 75 years of violence and yes, resistance, which was criminally executed. No question about that. The 7th of October included crimes against Israeli civilians, which shouldn't have happened. And at the same time, the world is changing, the tide is changing. So while justice is not perfect, it starts to be delivered, it starts to be served, and we need to build momentum.
And on the building of momentum, the reaction to the ICC ruling, especially by some Western nations, surprised many people. Here's one question on that.
We've seen some EU countries clearly stating that they would not arrest Netanyahu if he came into their territory. As signatories to the Rome Statute, are there any repercussions or sanctions for the countries that violate the ICC arrest order? Can the country face any charges, and in which way?
I am also shocked and appalled by the words uttered by a number of countries. Well, there are ostensibly fascist figures in the European landscapes. Not many, thankfully, but there has been a rise of the right. So in Europe, like in other places in the world. So it's no surprise that they put the legality and respect for rule of law, respect for the international law system at the very bottom of their priorities, if they are present among their priorities at all.
And while we have the privilege of discussing all these issues here and talking about the potential for a new world order, of course, the violence continues in Gaza, unabated. People are still there, stuck under bombardment. And on that, we have one final question for you from Sumia.
Hello, Francesca. Thank you for holding this space. My question is the following. What hope of resolution do you see to the conflict, and within what timeline?
Interesting. Thank you, Sumia. Yesterday, I was giving a lecture during which, at the very beginning, I brought to the fore the word hope. Hope is the light that is left in darkness, we are told. And hope is like that light that allows us to move forward. But also hope is, as it was said, a discipline. And we need to be clear about what this hope, like a strength that keeps us going, is for. And it's for the betterment. So we cannot allow ourselves the luxury of both being strategic and being active in order to pursue justice and accountability and freedom and dignity for all between the river and the seas, both Israelis and Palestinians, because none of them is free until there is an apartheid regime that makes racial segregation and domination the rule rather than something to be banned from civilian life.
There's no time frame from that answer there, but I'm happy with that, and I'm sure Sumia will be too. We started with a voice from Gaza, and I would like to end with a note from you, a message perhaps to those stuck in Gaza today and to all Palestinians across occupied land. What is your message to these people today?
My message to you is that you are not alone. I know it feels like you have been abandoned by the world, and you have not. You are the frontliner victims of a corrupt system that we need to fix from outside. And we are doing all we can, possibly not all of us, we are few, but we are doing all we can, and we need more people to join us, and we are making sure that the revolution that is needed to make sure that the genocide, the occupation, and the apartheid end as soon as possible becomes a reality for you, but also for us.
Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur on Occupied Territories of Palestine, thank you so much for being part of the stream. And thank you all for tuning in. Stay in touch with us online. Send us your comments, questions, and suggestions with the hashtag or the handle AJStream. Take care, and I'll see you soon.